All right, we're on the air live. Okay, today, this is Office Hours Week 9, and, I'm really happy to have Alex on with us today. Alex, I think most of you should have seen his video by now about energy in Nepal, and we're going to talk a little bit about that, and we're going to talk a little bit about, energy in general, and how we're going to get, a better distribution of energy around the planet. And then we're going to answer some of your questions for the week. Okay, so I'm going to give Alex though just an opportunity to kind of give you an update on how things sit in Nepal and his little NGO and what his plans are, in addition to what maybe he had time to talk about on the videos. So, Alex, what do you want to start with?
Well, good morning or afternoon, wherever you are online, and it's great to have so many students here. Greetings from Nepal, from all the villagers we are working with, and as we speak, we are working right now in 11 different villages in 2 major districts in the northwestern part of Nepal, in the district of Humla, as well as in the district of Jumla. I will be going there again end of February. I will be there for almost 3 months, working with my staff and with our local people along, putting my hands to work in these various projects. And as you might have seen and realized from the website, we are not working only in direct access to improved energy services, but as well, for example, in literacy classes and in direct health related issues as well. However, improved access to energy services is and will continue to be a central point to alleviate and improve the condition of staggering poverty.
Okay, so we're going to start with some questions, and I'm probably going to elaborate on some of these as we go. So this is from Fred M, and he says, given the extent to which governance uncertainties or negative interference can affect the long-term success of Dr. Zhand's project, is there a family of 4++ strategy to deal with this overarching issue? So let me put that into maybe a question, which is, Alex, when you're trying to do things in Nepal, how much do you rely or are you influenced by, the local government or the federal government? And then I also want you to talk about, social acceptance of these projects, because it's sort of independent of government regulation or how they interfere, you have to have people accept that this is something that they want. And I know sometimes they do, and it's fantastic. And I know you were telling me the story about, when power goes out, then they're very upset after they've had it. So, but if you could just talk a little bit about how you integrate energy into Nepal and how maybe it's different than what we're used to seeing here in the developed countries.
Yes, that's a very good question. We work very closely with the local government agencies together. Nepal as a government has departments which are directly supervising the local non-governmental or NGO organizations in order to manage them in a way that they don't duplicate work too much. It has been difficult in the last years, but after the war, which finished in 2006, and then from 2007 onwards, we had again a government, it became much better. So we do work with local governments together, but the very first step is for every project, and as we have now been for 10-15 years in these 2 areas, the local villagers come to us, RITS Nepal, and usually request a project partnership because they have seen in neighboring villages how life has changed and improved and become much better. So they usually come with a letter of request, and we usually ask them, please have all the families who would like to really participate in this project partnership sign. So usually all the families sign right away because they do see the benefits. So we sit together with the local elders of our villages, and then we discuss. They know what the villagers in neighboring villages have been changing, like solar lighting or improved access to more food through the greenhouses or the smokeless metal stove, pit latrines or clean drinking water, and so on. So I would say from my last 20 years practical experience, 85% of the time the local people themselves as a community identify to have a pit latrine, a stove inside the kitchen to avoid the open fireplace cooking, basic indoor lighting, and access to clean drinking water as their main issues. And then we finally said, okay, that's the family of four. These are the four pillars.
Yeah.
And that's how we go then. And then we create project proposals, find donors, because the people are so impoverished they can participate very, very little in financial capacity. However, they participate a lot in sweat work. And once we have agreed, the villagers have agreed, we have a potential donor for the rest of the financial demands, we go to the Nepali government and present it to the government agencies, 2 or 3 agencies, centrally in Kathmandu, the capital, as well as locally in Humla or in Jumla, the local. And once they have approved, then the donor, financial donor, are able to send us the finances and we start working with the local people. That's the rough concept we follow.
So can I take that then that the central government of Nepal, the federal government of Nepal, is willing to provide some resources to put the family of four into these more remote villages? Or I would imagine they're relatively limited on what resources they have as well.
They will not give any financial resources. Okay. However, they try to be more central point of organizing. There is this so-called Social Welfare Council in Kathmandu, where you have to register an NGO if your NGO, non-governmental organization, is established near the capital. And they organize basically that things are not duplicated too much. And they work as well with the local district departments of the extended arm, so to say, of the development department. So there is an organization behind. It's not running that smoothly usually, but at least it's a good start. And we give a lot of care and time from Reach Nepal to really be transparent and share everything and have the government approval before we even step into the village with active work.
All right, so here's a related question. We're going to take some related questions on this, and then we'll come back to some of the different ones. As we heard from Dr. Zhand, Nepal is the ideal place to install renewable energy resources. However, the situation in Nepal is really miserable for the people. Well, I'm not sure I'd say it that way, but there's definitely poverty. Okay, why have the energy companies didn't invest there? Is there any problem with the policy or the paperwork? And I should say energy companies, there are no electrical energy companies outside of Kathmandu. So I assume you mean the big international, multinational oil companies. And that's a topic that we're going to get into in sort of a different set of questions, but I'll let Alex answer that one first, and then I want to have a follow-up.
Yeah, another very good question, which I'm happy that you posed that, because there are some important answers to be given to your question. In Nepal, per se, Nepal has only one government-owned electricity utility, so-called Nepal Electricity Authority, NEA. They are centralized in Kathmandu, and they are overlooking and planning the more or less 99% hydropower plant building and generation. They used to build all their own. They have in recent years, in particular after the war finished, more contract provided to Indian companies and Nepali private companies to invest in hydropower plants. However, even these hydropower plants are in the lower megawatt range. Nepal is a country which has 28, 29 million people, is fairly widespread. So we have small pockets of small communities. Now, where we work in the very remote areas without the access to road within days of walking, we have to see that we have consumers which are consuming tiny, tiny amounts of energy. We are not even talking in the kilowatt hour range per day like we used to do in Europe or in America here. Not at all, we are in the watt-hour range. Now, to have an infrastructure set up for watt-hours sales for a utility is absolutely makes no economic sense whatsoever. Yeah. And that is an inherent problem of rural village electrification in very remote areas for the first time.
Yeah.
So that's often done with NGOs or through donations and other sponsorship, but very, very rarely by companies, because it just does not make economic sense.
Okay, and so the follow-up question I'm going to have is that, although you might ask, why have the energy companies not invested there? And I think, as Alex explained, for the big electric companies, it doesn't make economic sense. In China and India, the governments there, which are much, much larger, the populations are much larger, so they have much bigger resources. They're now electrifying those countries. So they're putting in electrical wires. They're building the power plants, primarily coal-fired power plants, unfortunately, but they're building the power plants to generate the electricity, and they're going to bring it to the rural areas. So that has not happened yet in Nepal. But I think what we have an opportunity to do on this planet now is to take some renewable energy sources, especially photovoltaic and wind, things that can generate electricity, right? The people of Nepal don't need gasoline and diesel to drive their cars, because they don't have cars, they don't have roads there, right? So they need electricity. So one of the things that I want to challenge our students to, and that we are in the process of trying to organize with something called a company, a .org company, is how are we, those of us who are taking this class and saving our electrons. So for example, I'm putting photovoltaic on my roof. So now I am no longer taking those electrons from San Diego Gas and Electric. How are we going to send those electrons over to Alex? And we're going to come up with a plan to do that. And the idea behind that is that we're going to put the challenge out there, and then we're going to let the community crowd idea this, like crowdsource it, like crowd fund it, except we're going to come up with the ideas on how we're going to ship those electrons over to Alex. It's obviously not going to be by putting an extension cord into the Pacific Ocean and having Alex put one on the other side and then run it up to Nepal. So we're going to find a way to do this. And so the challenge that I want to put to all of our students out there is, you guys are very clever guys. You're very dedicated to this. So let's figure out a way so we can get electrons to Alex and he can redistribute those in Nepal. And I have some ideas maybe on how we're going to do that. Maybe we're going to buy some photovoltaic cells and ship them over there. Maybe we're going to buy some wind turbines, but I want you guys to think about this too and come up with some clever ways so that we're not relying, and I don't think we should, on the planet, think that simply because a company is big and makes a lot of money, that it's their responsibility to go give that money away to people who need it, right? So if you're an energy company and you make your money selling energy, it would be great if you could take a little bit of your resources and help get energy to the people of Nepal. But it's not their sole obligation. That's our obligation as well. So we're going to think about that, and I'm going to challenge you guys as students to come up with ideas and send them to us. And Alex is also going to come up with ideas because he's actually there and knows what he could use. Okay. I want to bring up one here that somebody asked about, a rocket stove. Where did that one go? Because I don't know anything about these things, but I want Alex to tell me what a rocket stove is. Where did our little question go here?
Maybe in the meantime, till Steve has found the question, just to the previous question, I would say, while the situation energy-wise looks dire to some extent, if you look from a more Western point of view where we are spoiled with access to energy, we also can see a positive point in the sense of we can learn from our mistakes we have done in the developed world, so-called developed world, because the last 50 years we have generated and used energy in very unsustainable ways. So what we can learn from that is in Nepal that we can leapfrog, and as Steve just mentioned, we don't go for oil or gas turbines, or so neither in the Kathmandu capital, where we do have roads and cars and we need petrol to drive. But in the remote areas where there are no roads and nothing, we don't need to even think of that. We can leapfrog and say, we have plenty of sun, we have wind, we have biomass. Let's use the local available renewable energy resources to generate energy and therefore improve the access to energy services.
Okay, I found our question here, and it says, is Dr. Zhand familiar with rocket stoves, J-tubes, and the mass heaters for efficient use of biomass for heating and cooking? So I don't know what a rocket stove is, but apparently Alex does. So he's going to tell us if he's familiar with it and what they do.
Well, thank you for that question. Yes, I know about the rocket stove. I have never used one, but I have seen and read about it. The rocket stove was developed in America by an NGO, and the rocket stove is more a biogasifier type, more in this direction. While it works and it combusts and provides heat and flame and energy to cook and so, which is great, I have my strong concerns in other ways. If you look on our ritz-nepal.org website and you go to the family of 4 and you go to the smokeless metal stove website, you see that that stove I designed out of metal as well looks completely different than a rocket stove. A rocket stove is basically, simply saying, for those who don't know, it's basically a vertical tube. You put firewood at the bottom in, and it has no door, and on top you have one flame coming and a pot where you cook. Now, culturally speaking, in the area we work, we have a traditional meal, which is lentils, a vegetable dish, and rice if available. So that means we have 3 different kinds of dishes, which ideally should be cooked all together so that everything is warm at the same time and not overcooked, and not being put aside so that the second dish can be cooked, or the third, and by that time flies are sitting on it and get contaminated, which is presently the case in open fire cooking place. With a rocket stove, that would be still the case. And the rocket stove has no pipe and no exhaust where it will take the little smoke, much less than an open fire, of course, out of the room, which is one of the big problems for respiratory diseases and for cancerous diseases, lung diseases, which people suffer. And therefore, the rocket stove in our context would not be ideal, would not be a so-called contextualized technology, as I tried to explain in our lecture what I mean by that. Contextualized technology for the stove, as well as for any other technology or even infrastructure for that sake, is to understand first the local people's culture and context and resources available, as well as skill, education, and financial capacities. I call that all under context. And once we have understood that, which is only able after we have really intensively spent a lot of time with the local people, talking, sharing, questioning, looking over their shoulder, how they do things the way they do, and asking and understanding them. Once you have understood that, then we can go back to the drawing board and use our skills we have learned in our universities and design a stove, design a greenhouse, design a solar water heater, and so on. And then discuss again with the local people how they think it is. Then we create prototypes, use them in the local villages, and amend them and change them again according to their desires. That's what I call it. The rocket stove would not work with that. Neither the J-tube, if I understand you correct what you mean, it's just basically also similar to a rocket stove, but has a bend entry at the bottom. So it's like a 90-degree elbow, just longer the top, so that you can put one pot on top. Very inefficient use of firewood, of local resources. You cannot really adjust the combustion process ideally or good as compared to the stove I designed, and you can find on the internet website, which has a door in front, which you can be adjusted. The airflow can be adjusted, as well as the exhaust through the damper can be adjusted, and therefore the flames can be adjusted, and combustion process is most likely more efficient overall.
Okay. And then I would just say one of the other groups that I know Alex and I have talked about before are Engineers Without Borders. So I think there's an opportunity for the students, who are taking this class to think about, getting over to Nepal and getting down to places that where people need this, and bringing your expertise and learning how the locals do things and learning from them, and then also bringing maybe some of the technology that you guys have learned about. Okay, I'm going to jump to a different topic because this question is up there, and I'll answer this one. It's intended for Tim Zank, and Tim's not here today. So it says, Dr. Mayfield, Mr. Zank talked about the concern of the military as to energy security. Okay, so I'm going to get back and answer that one. Does the military fund basic research in renewable energy? Okay, that's part 2. And then how does intellectual property rights and patents work when the military is involved? So let me take those 3 different questions. So first of all, so the United States Navy, but specifically, but in general, the US military spends an enormous amount of time looking around the planet and seeing where trouble is coming. And they do that because in general, they're the group that gets called when trouble shows up someplace. The United States has sort of become the police department for the world. When they do this, and when they do this analysis, what they say is their number one concern for what is going to cause trouble in the future is climate change. And why is that? It's not because there's going to be more rain or not because there's going to be rising sea level, although those things could be very important. It's because what climate change does is it displaces people. So in many parts of the world, especially the developing world, if you have a drought that lasts for many years, your solution isn't to go build a dam and make a reservoir or drill a very deep well, right? Because you simply don't have the resources to do that. The way you solve that problem is you move to someplace else that doesn't have a drought, right? You pick up your family and you go to someplace where you can feed them. And so what climate change will do, and what climate change is already doing, is displacing people. It's getting them to move from one part of the world to a different part of the world. This is very true in North Africa now, and the migration from North Africa over the last several years into Europe. Some people think this is brought about by political unrest. They say, oh, well, the real problem is, Boko Haram or ISIS or whatever the jihadist group are. They're forcing those people to leave. Well, the truth of the matter is they're forcing those people to leave because the resources have dwindled in that place and those people are unhappy, so they get guns and go shoot everybody. That's sort of the standard operating procedure of humankind for the last million years. So the reason the military worries about climate change is because you displace people. Because when you displace people from one country to another, that does two things. Those people have now moved to a new country and they need resources, food, shelter, etc., that they're demanding from there. And the people who are there are losing those things. And so they don't like that. And that's why conflicts start. Okay? And as I said, you really see this in North Africa and the Middle East right now, right? That people who are leaving Syria and going to Iraq or going to Turkey, these are causing problems because they're displaced, right? In addition to the political problems that are in. Okay. So that's why the military calls it their number one concern for security on the planet is actually climate change. And that is due to increased amount of fossil fuel. Okay. So does the military fund basic research? They absolutely do. The group that is front and center on this is the United States Navy. And the United States Navy doesn't do this because they're great green guys. They do this for the simple, practical, solution that if we can get renewable energy, if we can slow climate change, and if we can get energy to the people who need it, like in Nepal or in North Africa or in sub-Saharan Africa, then those people are much more likely to be happy, and then they don't go cause trouble, which then the military has to go and intervene. Okay, so the military does this for selfish reasons, and they are very analytical about this, right? Like I said, they don't go and look and say, oh, we think this would vaguely be good for the environment, right? They go and say, this will be good for our future conflicts if we can solve these problems, which are energy and which are climate change. So they fund research to do that, and they integrate that research. The United States Navy has something called the Great Green Fleet that they are running on biofuels, or I shouldn't say all biofuels. They run on fuels. They also have nuclear power as part of that. They of course have nuclear submarines. They have nuclear aircraft carriers, so they consider that part of the solution as well. But biofuels are also part of it. You don't fly jets, and most of their boats don't run on nuclear power. They run on diesel or on jet fuel, and they are investing in the basic research to get those. And so the final part of the question is, how does intellectual property rights and patents work when the military is involved? The same way it does when any government funding comes out. It used to be that 20 years ago, what the government would say is that if we fund this research, you guys need to send back to us a disclosure on your invention and we'll decide if we patent it or not. And that just was a complete disaster. It never worked because patents are kind of expensive to prosecute. And it's almost impossible for people who aren't really deep experts in that one field to know what the value of a patent is. It's still a problem today, right? I have lots of inventions that come out of my lab that I think are going to be enormously valuable. And then I go talk to attorneys or somebody else and they're like, you don't have any idea what you're talking about. Why would those be valuable? So it's really hard for somebody else to judge the future value of intellectual property and then make a payment today. So about 15 years ago, we passed something in the United States called the Birch-Bayh-Dole Act, which said, if you invent something on US government money and you patent it, more power to you, you get to keep it, just make sure it gets deployed. And originally some people complained about that. They said, hey, wait a minute, why should a guy write a grant, write a proposal to the government and get a grant, and then he gets the economic benefit out of it? That's not good for taxpayers. But it turned out to be a brilliant idea, because what it did was it allowed startup companies to come and deploy that intellectual property and actually make products out of it. And the only benefit to mankind and the only benefit to the taxpayer does not come out of writing papers and does not come out of writing patents. It comes out of making products that get used, right? So, famously the, DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Procurement Organization, loves to tell everybody about all the money they spent to build the internet. They never made a penny from that basic research for the internet, but all of us enormously benefited from it, especially those of you watching us today, okay? So we get the patent. So if I get a grant from the Navy, I had one from the Air Force. If I get a grant from the Air Force and I make an invention on it, I can patent it and I can license it. I'm supposed to give preferential treatment to startup to small companies, because small companies create more jobs than big companies, and small companies tend to be more dedicated about getting new technology out. And so that worked absolutely brilliantly and continues to work today. So every time I get a chance, I always say thank you to the US Navy. These guys are always leading the charge. These were the first group that took us from wind power to coal power, more than 100 years ago. They took us from coal power to petroleum to diesel power. They took us from diesel to nuclear power. That was all the US Navy. They were way out in front. And one of the Navy admirals loves to tell the story, how back in the early parts, when they were switching from wind to coal power on their boats, there was an enormous uproar from the sailing community, because fire on a boat is the worst thing you can have. And those were wooden boats back in the day. They were not steel. And if you're out in the ocean and your boat catches on fire, you are in big trouble. So many people were very resistant to this idea and said this was a crazy, stupid idea. What are you thinking about? But obviously, once they got coal powered on, they could go much quicker than sailing boats. And so in very short order, the US Navy dominated the world because of that. And then obviously everybody else followed. They are now doing the same thing with green renewable energy. They have decided to put themselves out front and say, we're going to be the group that's going to integrate renewable fuels into our fleet. There's been some pushback, from the Republicans in Congress whining about this, but that's all economic whining, right? Basically, they're getting money from the fossil fuel companies for their campaigns, and so therefore they say, oh, green energy is bad. The Navy doesn't care, and they don't listen, right? They fortunately, the Navy does not have to answer, to any individual congressman. They have to answer to Congress, and they have to answer to the American people, but not to individual guys. So they are out front pushing this. They know it's important. They've got all the facts and statistics behind it. Okay, so let's get back to questions for Alex here. Okay, so here's a really important one. So we're gonna pull this one up, and it says, Dr. Zhand mentioned deforestation as a problem in Nepal, right? This is worldwide a problem when people are cutting down their forests to get light and to get heat and cooking. In the 4+ dynamic, could replanting the trees and introducing pinyon pines as a food source be a possibility? I'll let Alex answer that, and I'll talk about food sources if Alex wants me to.
Yes, I'm not at all a forest-oriented person, but a very good question. Deforestation is a problem. We have about 1.7 to 2% per year. We have increase of deforestation, especially in these very remote, high-altitude areas. As we all know, in the higher you go, the slower trees and vegetations grow. In the Himalayas, as a rough rule of thumb, and don't quote me on that, but that's a rough rule, about at 4,000 meter altitude, which is about 13,000 feet roughly, the trees stop growing. there are no trees. Even the high Himalayan pine tree is not growing anymore. And the closer you go there to 4,000 meter altitude, the slower they grow. Now, of course, with the high biomass cutting and the utilization and the growth of population, forests are just cut down. Reforestation is a very good idea. Many, many organizations have tried. Very few have succeeded over long term. Now, what I'm talking here is, if you are an NGO and you have on an average 1 or 2 years project life cycle for funding from donors, which is the common thing, 1 to 2 years, not much more, unfortunately. Well, you're going to plant in 1 year, and after 2 years you have no funds. After 2 years the trees haven't even started growing yet. That is one issue which is really a problem. Another big problem is more cultural related. In our areas, for example, the goats are good as they are in other ways. They are a pest for the forest and for all the greens in forests and meadows, high altitude meadows. They just eat anything they can get across, so it's really a problem. We have goats, we have cows, we have yaks. They are all roaming around wildly most of the time, unless it's the harvest, it's the major growing season and close to the harvest. People try to keep them away from their fields, because they would even eat this. So the problem with reforestation is fence a huge area in and let no goats and cows and yaks into this area. You will find it very difficult to have any successful reforestation, and it will take 10-20 years that really trees started to grow. So that means we would need to change the culture and behavior. How do we raise goats? How do we keep goats? How do we keep animals per se? Presently we have houses built out of stone and mud. Usually the bottom part is for the animals, for the goats, for the cows, for the yaks. They will be brought in the night so that they are safe from wild animals, bears and wolves and others. And in the middle, the people live. They have their living room, kitchen, sleeping room, and on top it's usually flat mud roof. They usually have their crops for drying and other stuff at work. So if we want to domesticate these animals, we have to build complete different houses. And if you're talking of different house building, we're talking of a deeply rooted cultural issue, which you cannot change overnight, not even over a year or 10 years. It's a traditional, generational issue. So while I went to a little bit to the extent to answer this question, I just want you to understand the importance. It's not just trying to have 1 million seedlings made available, which is the easy part. Difficult though it is, 1 million seedlings we can make available and plant them. We can even get the people to plant them. But how do we sustain them? How do we keep them watered during the dry season, when they in particular need more moisture and have no deep roots in this shallow ground which is full of stones? And during the dry season, 4 or 5 months, no drop of rain. Very, very difficult. And how do we keep them away from the goats? So there are huge problems which have to be tackled before, thought through carefully, and with a 10-20 years at least time frame thought. And how do we domesticate animals so that they can live in a way they are, at least hygienically speaking, can be domesticated for several months at a time and not just one night, which changes the whole infrastructure needed in a house.
Okay, so I'll just follow that up to say one of the challenges that we have, and this is universal on the planet, is how do we produce food more efficiently? We actually have the other side of the debate here in the United States now, which is in agriculture, in American agriculture, we became hyper efficient at producing, grains, corn, and then soybeans, etc. And we raise animals in really intense, close environments right? We have chickens in 2 square feet, right? And so this is a very efficient way to grow them, but not necessarily a healthy way to grow them. So now we're getting pushback in the States to go in the opposite direction, to get free range chicken, to get grass-fed beef. Well, every time you do that, they take up a bigger footprint on the land. All right. So it's a balancing act, and the equation has not been solved yet, right? And then the equation will never be solved. We're always going to make improvements to this. But I think one of the things we can do is, think through our actions and not let just pure economics drive them. And by pure economics, what I mean is, okay, it's cheaper to produce chickens if we grow the grain someplace and then stack the chickens in these enormous houses and feed them. But it's probably not healthy. Well, it's certainly not healthy for the chickens, and ultimately it's not healthy for us. So we need to get a balance between that. But we also need to understand that there's 7 billion people on the planet, and the balance between that can't be that everybody gets 100 acres and 2 cows and a couple of chickens to grow, because we simply don't have enough land for that anymore. We did in the past, we don't anymore. So this is something that we want to be thoughtful about, and this is something that the urgency is really coming upon us now. And this is also part of the basic, discussion of this class, is that energy and food are directly related, as are water, as are people's perception of their quality of life, and their income. So all of these things are interrelated. I believe energy is at the heart of them, but many things that Alex is doing now. So for example, if you bring in electric light bulbs, which are much, much more efficient at putting out light than burning an open flame, just by doing that alone, you've already cut down deforestation a little bit, because now they don't have to cut down the trees and come in and put tar, the pine tar on them in order to burn for light. So every one of those steps adds something to this. And there won't be a single solution to it, and that solution will certainly not come from the United States. It cannot be a technology solution that we're just going to deliver over there like a magic bullet. But technology can help these things, as can adaptation, as can lots of things. And we need to explore all of those things. And that kind of takes us to this question right here. I think there's a good segue into this. And this comes from Bammy B. And he says, providing renewable energy devices to the poor of the world, while admirable, are baby steps to solve climate change problems. Do you agree, and what are your thoughts? Yeah, look, the biggest problem with carbon in the atmosphere are not the wooden stoves in Nepal. There is no question about that. NASA just released a beautiful, although alarming, video 2 days ago of CO2 emission, and it is all North America. It is the US, it is Europe, it is China. And so just Google that one. You guys will find it very easy. It's a computer model animation of CO2 being pumped out from all the cities. CO2 gets pumped out primarily from industrial process. That's the generation of electricity. That's a big source of it. But so is making cement, so is oil refining, so is every car driving up and down the road. If you really want to impact CO2 onto the planet, the way you do that is by getting rid of the internal combustion engine in all of its different forms. There's just no question about that, okay? If we got rid of all cars, if we got rid of all internal combustion or coal combustion for electricity, problem solved, okay? We have to generate electricity some way. We have to transport people around the world. That's what we're all used to. But that's a completely separate question of energy equality for the planet, right? These are two different things, right? And a very smart business guy I know always says, stop aggregating all your problems together and thinking that you can solve them with one thing. Disaggregate your problems, solve each one of them individually, and then collectively you'll find a solution, okay? So the baby steps for Nepal are a really important solution for them, okay? If you can get light, if you can get clean water, if you can get clean cooking stoves, if you can get greenhouses for food production longer, all of those things enormously improve the quality of life in Nepal. Do they do much to solve climate change for the rest of the world? No, but Nepal wasn't the problem with climate change in the rest of the world. So why are we trying to solve that problem in Nepal? That's not the problem we're trying to solve there. We've disaggregated these problems. They are related because they both have to do with energy, but they are completely distinct problems. So we're going to help Alex solve his little problem, but an enormous problem for Nepal. And we're going to make an improvement in those people's lives. Then separately, we're going to think about the much bigger global problem of climate change and how we reduce CO2. And by the way, most of that problem would immediately be solved if everyone in the developed country simply started living the lifestyle that we do in the undeveloped world, right? I guarantee you that the energy consumption in Nepal, not just of electricity, but of total energy overall, is a fraction of a percent. It's not even 1% of what we consume here in the United States. You know, when you add in all the clothes we make, all of the, you know, the cars we have, the iPhones, I'm sure all of you know, and I've told you this many times on this class before, the iPhone, that little smartphone you have, not just the iPhone, but any smartphone you have, uses more power every year than your massive refrigerator, okay? How can that possibly be? Because every time you do an internet search, Google or Yahoo or whoever you're searching through, someplace has an enormous data farm, an enormous bank of computers. And when you type in, you know, NGOs in Nepal, an enormous amount of electricity and energy gets sucked up searching all of those different things so it can send back to your iPhone, all right? So we're going to disaggregate those problems. We're going to help Alex solve his. But, you know, like I said, the worst thing you can do is think because we have this enormous climate change problem, we have to solve that one first before we solve the other ones. Completely untrue idea. Disaggregate your problems, solve them one at a time. World will be a much better place.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any comment on that?
I agree.
You completely
fully.
disagree. I know that.
I agree completely, because in Nepal, we people there in the area we work. I'm not talking here about Kathmandu, the urbanized area, but the very remote area. People are still trying to survive. It's a fight for survival. And to be very honest, most of them have never even heard about climate change, and they couldn't really bother less because they don't know what they're going to eat tonight and if their child is going to survive tomorrow. So what we are talking here is really the bottom end of survival, and in order to enable them a better standard and conditions, in order to make choices, in order to have opportunities like all we of us who are online now together had, for sure, that's when improved access to energy services becomes very crucial. And because we have learned from the past 50, 60 years that we can do better, that we can leapfrog certain technologies and not do the old stuff, and why do we start even in small, minuscule ways to start polluting? Then let's utilize the renewable energy resources right away and use solar and use wind and use biomass more efficiently, so that the local people don't need to fall into the trap our parents previously have fallen into, though we were ignorant at the time, but we are not anymore now, as we have to stand up to our responsibilities now, especially since the IPCC AR5 report in the 2nd of November, and now in 12th of November, the International Energy Agency report came out. We are shocked what will happen over the next 25, 30 years till 2040, when we will not reach the goal of 2 degrees Celsius. Most likely we will not. And the IEA just mentioned in their fact sheet, you can Google it, that 3.6 degrees much more likely the range we're going to have, because we will increase by 20% the annual carbon dioxide emission, and will till 2040. So we are far, far away, and still 75%, now it's 80% of all the energy generation, power generation, will be done by non-renewable, so-called fossil fuels, still 3/4, which is a very sad thing.
Yeah, but the one optimistic thing I will say on that is the vice president of Exxon. I use this quote many, many times. When I asked him what was he concerned about, was he concerned about climate change? Was he concerned about depletion of fossil fuels? He said, well, all of those are important issues, and we think about all of those, but what I'm really worried about is humans only operate under 2 modes. They do nothing, and then they overreact. You know, we just seem incapable as a species of actually seeing what our problem is that's coming, climate change from carbon emissions and actually doing something about it now.
Yeah,
We will choose to ignore it as long as we can. But as I said, this is actually optimistic, because at some point, then we'll start to do stuff. We'll overreact, and we'll spend way more money than we need to, and way more time. But at some point, we will start to address these things. But in the meantime, and I do want to bring this point up, in the meantime, even though the people of Nepal don't worry about climate change day to day, it is absolutely impacting them. And the sad part of climate change is that it actually impacts people much more who are not the ones who are putting out the CO2. The rich nations that put out a huge amount of CO2 have the resources to mitigate, the changes that come from that, right? So here in California, we're in a very bad drought right now. We're in year 3, about to go to year 4. We're in water rationing now in many different cities. But we have resources to do something about that, right? We actually just a couple weeks ago passed a bill to build new dams and new reservoirs and catch more runoff water, and people are digging wells. So we have the resources to do that. Is the drought brought about by climate change? Who knows? But it's certainly exacerbated by it. It certainly gets worse because of it. But the enormous rains that came last year to Nepal and to Pakistan and to India, were those climate change? I don't know, but in the future we're going to have more of those. So when those really bad floods came, those people simply lacked the resources to deal with those. So it's always the poorest people who suffer the most from changes like this.
And having been there for 20 plus years and talking with the local people, though they don't know the name climate change, when I ask them how has the rain pattern changed over the last decade or two, they can tell me very, very clearly how it used to be, how it is now. And having a very, very small carbon footprint in the world, indeed, they are the first ones to suffer the consequences of what the more developed, inverted commas, world emits in regard to greenhouse gases. Because this fragile, unique ecosystem, the Himalayas, are very, very sensitive to changes. And we see them already now.
Okay, here's a related question. It comes from Sophie G. Sophie always sends in good questions, I'd say, and listen, send in any question you want. We don't have politically incorrect questions here. We will attempt to answer everything. Okay. How can climate change believers, scientists, economists, everyday people, make climate change a baseline concern for the government, whatever your political affiliation? So this is an enormous problem. The reason this is an enormous problem, right, is twofold. One, and we've talked about this many times, energy is the #1 economic driver of the planet. Over $6 trillion a year. When you have a number that is that big, that is employing that many people, there are economic considerations, and economic considerations almost always trump everything else. If a decision is going to be made that is going to put you out of a job or cost you money, you suddenly don't like that decision, whatever it is. And facts and science and everything else be damned, all right? So that's our #1 problem, right? And the reason there's a political affiliation with this is because people who are impacted by energy tend to donate a lot more money, to the Republicans than they do to the Democrats. So for the Republicans, this has become a big climate change can't be real, okay? But as an individual, what you can do about that is stay the course. Right? Which means I have lots of friends, that are old white guys like me, and they tell me, oh, climate change isn't real. Oh, it's overhyped. And you know what I do? I just tell them, you guys, happy to send you the scientific information. You're wrong. You're making an enormous gamble, and you're making that gamble not with your future, because you're going to check out of here before climate change really has an impact. You're making this on your kids' future. So how certain are you that you don't want to spend a few dollars now to make sure that your kids live in a better planet 30 or 40 or 50 years from now? And I have to say, for most of them, that usually pipes them down a bit, because then what they say is, well, okay, yeah, I'm concerned about the future for my kids. Well, great. Then stop gambling with their future, because that's really what you're doing. What you're saying is, I'm not willing to spend a little bit of money now right? Because I'm going to believe that it's not going to cost my kids a fortune later. It's going to cost them a fortune later. You know, money spent now will come back 100-fold or 1,000-fold later. So you just stay the course. You know, you keep getting the facts and you talk to everybody you can about this. All right. And when they tell you it's not true and when they deny it, just give them that little smile like, oh, you poor blithering idiot. And then just go on with your life. Okay. That's what, at least that's my philosophy. That's the way I do it. Okay. Let's take another one here from Mitchell. Mitchell always asks good questions. Mitchell says, is it possible for the people of Nepal to build a water tower near a lake that draws water up during the day using wind, solar, or animal power, and will discharge the water at night to generate electricity or light? Well, let me just say, technically, is that possible? Absolutely. Would anybody in Nepal have the resources? I will let Alex answer that one.
Technically possible, as Steve said, but usually the geographical conditions don't demand that. First, there are not very many lakes around where people live close by. There is one in the western area, the biggest one in Nepal, that's Rara Lake, but that's a national park, so no villages really are around that lake. However, we have mountains and water sources roll down the mountains, and we utilize those. We utilize them for drinking water systems, so gravity-fed drinking water systems, village drinking water systems usually, because the local people have usually built their village nearby a water resource, because without water you can't live or sustain yourself and your family and your animals for a long term. So water has to be somewhere. Usually people gather around water sources. So we have done more than 10 villages now with so-called gravity-fed drinking water systems. Then there are these small little streams we can utilize to generate small kind of powers. We call them pico-hydropower. Pico-hydropower in Nepal, not in China, because there is a potence bigger of scale. But in Nepal, we have between 0 to 5 kilowatt generating power. We will call pico. All beyond 5 kilowatt to 100 kilowatt would be microhydro. Beyond that would be then hydropower. In Nepal, I have to say, not in China. So we do utilize more the flowing water rather than pump, because it would be too costly per unit base. If we would have to pump it up and then let the water come down again, basically as a storage, because turbine, if you use one turbine to pump and to generate, the efficiency is usually much lower. Rather than 90%, it will be the 75 higher percentage little bit, but by far not as efficient as you only design a turbine for hydropower generation.
Yeah, I think little hydropower projects could be a fantastic opportunity for Nepal. Obviously, the one enormous advantage they do have when you have big high mountains like they've got is those things capture snow, and then that water comes as runoff. Nice. And when you have water at very high elevations that's going to very low elevations, that has an enormous amount of energy in it, and some of that you can get out. But there are environmental consequences to that, right? If you dam rivers to put in hydroelectric plants, even small ones, you change the ecology of that river. So we're getting a little, in this country, believe it or not, we're getting rid of some of our dams. We've taken a few of them out because they were simply too detrimental and changed the environment in really radical ways. But like I said, everything is a balance, and we have to think about that. Okay, we have time for about one more question, and I'm going to put this last one to Alex and give him an opportunity to answer this. Question says, most of Dr. Zhand's contextualized renewable energy devices are useful for every poor family in Nepal. But how much time will it take if those devices are used in small steps of the family of four plus? So what is the strategy for adoption? So Alex, I'm going to put this more broadly, which is, what's your plan for the next year and the next couple years? And then I want you to tell the students how we're going to help you realize those plans.
As previously said, the family of four came together based on practical experience of living and working with the local communities in these high altitude remote areas, so that they themselves identified pit latrines, smokeless metal stove, basic indoor lighting, and access to clean drinking water as their 4 main issues. Therefore, I made this family of 4 a fairly rigid concept, a family of 4, so that a whole village, every family should agree to implement that, so that all the paths in the village and nearby the village and the river and the fields are free of defecation, and all the families and all the people have access to clean drinking water, and so on. The family of 4 plus is much more a flexible concept, means that once the family of 4 is in place and people have experienced 1-2 years afterwards already significant changes, they all of a sudden say, oh, we are hungry, we would like to have more food. Therefore, the high altitude greenhouse came into being. And other issues as well, education, literacy classes, and so on, numeracy classes, and so on, and slow sand water filter and solar dryer in order to dry the more grown vegetable so that they can store it for the winter, or even dry it, store it, and sell it during the winter when they can catch a much higher price, and therefore start to generate income, which is one of the big steps we are going into in 1 or 2 villages now, slowly. After 10 years of just trying to survive, they can now finally start to generate a little bit more income. So it's a step-by-step approach. You're very right. It's the adoption of technologies, in particular contextualized technologies. I would like to not only use that word, which I have explained before. Contextualized technologies are technologies developed once we have understood the context and the environment of where the people live in. But technologies and infrastructure developed in such a sense, they have to be inculturated as well. We want to have technologies taken up by culture over the years and generations to come, and that is just time demanding. So adoption will take time, and we continue to work like that. As previously mentioned, we work presently in 11 villages in Humla and Jumla district. We continue to do so. I have presently 4 project proposals are submitted to new donors, and I'm very anxious and awaiting and praying that most of these proposals get through and will be funded, so that in January, February 2015 we can continue to build upon the successes we have been having the last 15 years, and more villages and communities can have access to the family of 4 and family of 4 plus. I'm building at the moment with one friend from New Zealand, from Tasmania, Australia, basically, I have to say, a pico hydropower turbine for which we have no funding yet, and we would like to have partners and people more engaged in that, because as Stephen just mentioned before, pico hydro, very small, minuscule type of watt, rather, or low kilowatt range power generation is really an amazing opportunity, because it's small, it's manageable, it's payable for the local people. The megawatt or high 100 kilowatt or even dozens of kilowatt micro hydro turbine power plants, the local people simply can just not afford to operate and maintain. They just can't raise these funds. So we have to start very, very small with watt bulbs, and then only with mobiles maybe to come, and then only with oil expellers who can consume 2-3 kilowatts and so on. So that's slowly, and that will take years. And we continue to do that. Watch our website, www.ritz-nepal.org or ritz-switzerland.org, where we try to update now and then with pictures and projects and so on. Or send me an email if you are interested as well, what we are doing. But we continue in 2015 as we are doing now, hopefully expanding in 1 or 2 more villages.
Okay, and end it there for today. We're going to thank Alex for taking the time to come out and talk to us.
Thanks for having me.
And I'm going to encourage all of our students to get out and do something. Take a small step to make the world, a little better place, a little more energy independent. Thank you all.